The tray hit the floor 11 seconds before anyone in Cafeteria Hall 3 understood what they had just done. Nobody remembered the 11 seconds afterward. Not clearly. The Dravith who witnessed it from the near tables described it in 6 different ways to 6 different investigators, and none of the 6 accounts agreed on more than the color of the boy's jacket. That boy was Cale Osei, 16 years old, the only human enrolled at Threshold Academy, and up until that lunch period he had been, by every measure the school kept, the least remarkable student on the station. He did not raise his hand in class. He did not join the debate circle, the Orbital Sports League, or the cultural exchange dinners where the younger students were supposed to show off dishes from their homeworlds. He ate alone at the end of the 3rd table in Hall 3, using a metal fork his grandmother had shipped to him in a padded envelope because the cafeteria's issued cutlery was sized for Voss hands and Dravith mandibles, not human mouths. He was, in the words of his intake file, cooperative, quiet, and unremarkable in all academic and social metrics. The file had been written by an administrator who had never seen him move. Threshold Academy sat in high orbit above a neutral trade world called Ostren, a school built by the Confederacy specifically to put children of a dozen species in the same halls before they grew old enough to inherit their parents' opinions about each other. It was, on paper, a peace project. In practice, 16-year-olds behaved like 16-year-olds no matter what species they belonged to, and peace projects full of teenagers tend to develop hierarchies, whether the adults running them want that or not. The hierarchy at Threshold had a bottom, and for 2 years, that bottom had been Cale. It wasn't cruelty, exactly not at first. It was curiosity that had curdled into contempt. Humans were the newest species in the Confederacy, barely a generation removed from first contact, and the stories about them had not caught up to the reality. Everyone at Threshold had grown up hearing the humans were fast-aging, short-lived, physically fragile, prone to violent mood swings they called emotions, and mentally unstable in ways that made them unsuitable for serious diplomatic or military roles. Cale had heard every version of the rumor. He had also learned early on that correcting people rarely helped and sometimes made things worse. So he ate at the end of the 3rd table, alone, and he let the school believe what it wanted to believe. The Dravith who ran Hall 3 that year were led by a broad-shouldered youngling named Thesk, whose father sat on the trade council that partially funded the academy, which meant Thesk had never once been meaningfully disciplined for anything. Thesk found Cale fascinating in the specific way large young predators find small quiet things fascinating, not because the small thing is interesting, but because it never fights back, and that absence of resistance becomes its own kind of entertainment. Thesk and 4 of his usual companions, Volume 50, Kethra, ISS, and a Dravith named Tor, who mostly just laughed at whatever Thesk did, had spent that entire semester finding small ways to remind Cale where he stood. A shoved shoulder in the corridor. A translated insult muttered just loud enough. Homework accidentally knocked from a table. Nothing that would show up clearly on a disciplinary report, nothing that a school counselor could point to and call a pattern, because each piece looked small enough to laugh off on its own. On the day in question, Thesk decided to escalate, because the small things had stopped being funny, and he wanted something that would get a reaction. He walked past Cale's table with his own tray, angled it as if setting it down, and instead flipped the human's lunch across the floor and up the front of Cale's jacket in one smooth, practiced motion. Reconstituted stew, rehydrated grain, and a cup of something orange went across Cale's chest, lap, and the floor around his chair in a splash that made a wet, flat sound against the tile. The hall went quiet the way cafeterias do right before they get loud again. Thesk straightened up, already grinning, already turning to Volume 50 and Kethra to share the moment, already halfway through the first syllable of whatever joke he'd prepared. He did not get to finish it. What happened next took 4 seconds by the security timestamp, though everyone who saw it swore later it felt much longer. Cale's body reacted before his mind caught up to the insult, the way it had been trained to for 11 years. His grandfather, Nana Ajay, had not taught him wrestling for sport or fighting for pride. She had taught him a discipline she called the Safo Hene, a closed combat system passed down through her family that had nothing to do with striking first, and everything to do with what the body does automatically when someone crosses into arm's reach without permission, A system built, generation after generation, around the exact scenario of being small, being underestimated, and being touched by someone larger who assumed there would be no consequence. Thesk's tray had come within a hand's width of Kale's face on the follow-through. That was the trigger. Not the food. Not the humiliation. The proximity. Kale's left arm came up and redirected the tray's momentum before his conscious mind had finished registering what was happening, sending it up and back into Thesk's own jaw hard enough to snap his head sideways. In the same motion, Kale was already out of his chair, weight dropping low, and his right hand closed around the wrist Thesk had used to flip the tray. A human wrist. A human grip. But applied to a Dravith forearm. At an angle Dravith joints were never built to survive, with the kind of committed torque that came from 100,000 slow repetitions on a training mat back on Earth. Thesk's arm did not merely dislocate. Dravith joints are reinforced with a secondary bone strut for load-bearing in low gravity, and the sound it made tearing loose was audible 3 tables away. Volume 50 lunged in from the side a half-second later, the reflex of a friend seeing a friend hurt, and ran directly into Kale's rising elbow, which caught him under the mandible hinge and folded his jaw shut on his own tongue mid-shout. Kethra grabbed for Kale's shoulder from behind. Kale had trained for exactly that too. Nana Ajay's system assumed multiple attackers as a baseline, not an exception, and he pivoted into the grab instead of away from it, driving his weight backward and down. Kethra's own legs swept out from under her as she lost her base, and she went down onto the edge of an overturned tray hard enough to crack the resonance organ along her lower ribs, the delicate structure Dravith used for subvocal communication. She would not speak below a rasp for 6 weeks. ISS came in low, trying to tackle Kale's legs, a tactic that might have worked against another Dravith youngling, but assumed a center of mass Kale did not have. Kale dropped his own weight onto ISS's shoulders as he came in, using the boy's own charge against him, and ISS's collarbone gave way under the combined force. Tor never got close enough to be grabbed. Tor had made the single worst decision of the 5 by trying to flee sideways through the gap Kale had just cleared, and Kale's foot, already committed to a stance transition, caught him across the shin and sent him into the corner of the table hard enough to crack 2 ribs. For seconds. 5 Dravith on the floor. Kale standing in the wreckage of his own lunch, breathing hard, both fists still closed, food and stew running down the front of his jacket, staring down at what his body had just done with an expression the cafeteria's overhead camera would later capture with unusual clarity. Not triumph. Not fear. Something closer to disbelief. The hall erupted a half-second after that, the way rooms do once the brain finishes processing what the eyes have already seen. Administrator Voss Liaison Dreamek Ithel arrived at the scene 90 seconds later to find a cafeteria full of screaming teenagers, 5 injured students, and 1 human boy sitting perfectly still on the floor with his back against a table leg, arms wrapped around his knees, not resisting, not speaking, not doing anything except staring at his own hands. Dreamek had run Threshold's discipline office for 11 years. He had broken up fights between Yeth younglings whose claws could open a person to the bone, and once talked down a Corvain student who had tried to set a lab on fire over a failed grade. He had never, in 11 years, seen 5 students put in a medical transport within a single incident that the footage showed had lasted under 10 seconds. He had also never seen a student sit that still afterward. Most kids who'd just been in a fight were still riding the adrenaline, shouting, crying, arguing about who started it. Kale Osei looked like someone who had just watched a stranger use his own hands to do something he hadn't given permission for. Osei, Dreamek said carefully, crouching down out of arm's reach, a habit he did not examine too closely in the moment, but would think about later. Can you hear me? Kale nodded once. Are you hurt? Another shake of the head. Dreamek looked past him at the 5 students being loaded onto stretchers by the medical response team. Thesk's arm bent at an angle no Dravith joint should bend. Kethra being carried out with an oxygen mask clamped over the vocal slit at her throat. ISS unconscious from pain shock. Tor wheezing through visibly cracked ribs. Volume 50, still trying and failing to open his own jaw, and understood, with the particular cold clarity of someone whose career was about to become very complicated, that this was not going to stay a discipline office matter. He was right. It stopped being a discipline office matter almost exactly 40 minutes later, when the request for the security footage came not from the Dravith family's legal representative, which Dreamek had expected, but from the Academy's Xenobiology and Comparative Physiology department, which he had not. Dr. Senevak had spent 19 years studying comparative species physiology, and in all that time she had never had a research request approved this fast. She watched the footage 4 times before she said anything at all. The first time, she watched it at normal speed, the way anyone would. The second time, she slowed it to a quarter speed and watched Kale's stance transitions. The third time, she isolated just his hands. The fourth time, she brought in her department head, a Yeth professor named Cal Brannies, who had co-authored the Confederacy's standard reference text on human anatomy, and made him watch it in silence before either of them spoke. "That's not fighting," Brannies said finally. "That's a system. Look at his weight distribution on the third strike. He never once overextends. Every motion recovers into a stance that's ready for the next attacker before the current one's even finished falling." "He's 16, Senna said. "I know how old he is." So where did a 16-year-old human learn a combat system with that level of internal consistency? And why has nobody at this school ever seen him practice it? That question turned out to be easier to answer than either of them expected, because Kale, when asked directly by a counselor 2 days later, not a disciplinary officer, a counselor, because the Academy's legal team had quietly decided that framing mattered enormously right now, simply told the truth. He had been training since he was 5 years old. His grandmother had taught him, and her mother had taught her, going back through 5 generations of women in a farming town outside Kumasi who had developed and refined a system of close-quarters defense for a specific, ugly, practical reason. Because in the world his ancestors had grown up in, small people were sometimes attacked by larger people who believed there would be no consequences. And the women in his family had decided generations ago that there would be consequences. "She always told me it wasn't for showing off," Kale said, looking at a point somewhere past the counselor's shoulder. "She said if I ever had to use it for real, it meant something had already gone wrong, and using it right was just supposed to make sure it didn't go more wrong than it had to." "Did you know this would happen? If someone grabbed you like that?" "No," Kale said, and for the first time since the incident, something in his voice cracked slightly. "I didn't know it would be that. I've sparred with people. I didn't know Dravith joints were like that. I didn't know it would hurt them that much. I didn't get to choose. It just happened." That line went into Senevak's report almost word for word, because it was, she wrote, the single most important sentence in the entire case. He didn't get to choose. Human close combat reflexes, trained from early childhood, appeared to operate below the level of conscious decision-making once triggered by a specific set of proximity and contact cues, a finding that had enormous implications for how the Confederacy had been evaluating human physical capability for the better part of a decade, and none of those implications were reassuring. Her report reached the Confederacy's Species Integration Council within the week. It reached the fleet's bioanthropology division 4 days after that. By the time it reached a desk in a fleet recruitment office on a station 11 light years from Threshold Academy, it had picked up a very different kind of attention than Senevak had intended. And a woman named Commander Ayabo Adeyemi read it twice, made a single phone call, and booked passage to Ostren. None of that mattered to Kale in the days immediately after the incident, because he was too busy discovering what it felt like to be simultaneously the most talked-about student at Threshold Academy and the most isolated. The Dravith students, who had once mocked him from a safe distance, now avoided him entirely, which he might have found like a relief if it hadn't been so obviously rooted in fear rather than respect. He caught the way conversations stopped when he walked past. He caught the way even students who had never been part of Thest's group now gave him a wide berth in the corridors. The same wide berth you'd give a piece of unstable equipment. Thest's father, Counselor Brigath Valithan, a man whose Dravith honorific translated roughly to Senior Voice of the Trade Council, and who had never in his political career been made to feel small, did not take his son's hospitalization quietly. Within 72 hours, he had filed a formal grievance with the Academy's board demanding Kale's immediate expulsion, a public apology from the human diplomatic mission, and in a section of the filing that several board members privately found excessive even by the standards of an angry father, a review of whether uncontrolled juvenile combat instincts render the human species unsuitable for continued enrollment in mixed-species education. Dreamek Ithel, who had spent 11 years keeping his discipline office scrupulously fair, found himself in the uncomfortable position of reviewing footage that showed, beyond any reasonable dispute, that Thesk had initiated physical contact first, had, in fact, thrown food directly at another student's face, which under the Academy's own conduct code was itself grounds for suspension. The board convened 3 separate sessions to discuss what to do about a case where the student who caused 5 hospitalizations was also, unambiguously, the victim of the initiating offense. Kale was not expelled. He was not suspended. He was, instead, quietly moved out of Hall 3 and given a private lunch arrangement in a small administrative annex, which the Academy's public statement described as a temporary accommodation to reduce social friction, and which Kale understood, without anyone needing to explain it to him, as being locked away because the school didn't know what else to do with him. He called his grandmother that night, using the delayed subspace relay that made every conversation feel like talking through a held breath. "They're saying I might get sent home," he told her, once the connection settled and her face resolved on the small screen above his bunk, lined and steady in the way it had always been. "Do you want to come home?" Nana Ajay asked, and there was no judgment in it, just the question, plain. "I don't know. I keep thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't stopped in time. I didn't even feel like I had time. It just happened, Nana. My body did it before I decided anything." "That is what it is for," she said. "You think I taught you that system so you could decide calmly, in the moment, whether to use it? No. I taught you so that the choosing already happened, years before on the mat 1,000 times, so that when the moment came there would be no time to be afraid, no time to hesitate, no time to get hurt because you were still deciding what to do. The choice is not in the cafeteria, Kale. The choice was every morning you got up at 5 and trained with me instead of sleeping. That is where the choosing lives. 5 people are in a hospital because of a choice I made when I was 8 years old. 5 people are in a hospital because they put their hands on a person they had decided did not matter enough to think twice about," Nana Ajay said, her voice hardening for the first time. "You did not choose that they would do that. You only chose a long time ago not to be an easy person to do that to. There is a difference, and you had better learn it, because I promise you the people writing reports about you right now have not." Counselor Brigath Valithan did not accept the board's decision quietly, but he accepted it publicly, which was worse. In the 2 weeks that followed, he stopped demanding Kale's removal and started, instead, demanding something that sounded almost reasonable, a formal supervised demonstration to determine whether the human boy's uncontrolled reflex response could be replicated, studied, and, if it could not be safely managed, grounds for restricting human enrollment across the entire Confederacy school system, not just at Threshold. He framed it as science. He brought in an expert to make it look like science. The expert's name was Instructor Cadet, a retired Dravith combat trainer who had spent 30 years teaching close-quarters defense to Confederacy security forces, a man whose credentials were real and whose reputation was, by any honest account, formidable. Brigatha's petition to the board proposed a single supervised sparring session, full protective gear, medical staff on standby, conducted in the Academy's training annex rather than a public space. All of it designed to look like careful, responsible science, and none of it designed. Dreamek Ithel suspected the moment he read the proposal to actually be safe for Kale. He suspected it because he had quietly reviewed Caderes's service record, and Caderes had never in 30 years lost a supervised match against anyone under any grading system in the Confederacy's records, human or otherwise. Brigath was not proposing a study. He was proposing a beating with a research paper attached to it. And if it worked, if the retired instructor put the human boy on the ground in front of witnesses and cameras, it would functionally end the argument that had been building since the cafeteria. That whatever Kale had done was a fluke, an aberration, an accident of unfamiliar physiology rather than a real, replicable skill. Dreamek brought his concerns to the board. The board, worn down by 3 weeks of political pressure and increasingly aware that the Trade Council controlled a meaningful percentage of the Academy's funding, approved the demonstration anyway, over his objection, with conditions Dreamek considered barely adequate, and a schedule that gave Cale 4 days' notice. He told Cale himself in person, because he did not think this was news that should arrive over a message terminal. "You don't have to agree to this," Dreamek said. "I want you to understand that clearly. The board approved it, but they can't force you to participate. What happens if I say no? Counselor Volithan will say you're afraid to prove the incident wasn't deliberate. He'll say it in front of the full board and probably in front of every parent in the Trade Council's orbit. It will not end the pressure on you. It will just change what shape the pressure takes." Cale was quiet for a long moment, sitting in the small annex room that had become his lunch space, his temporary exile, the room where everyone had decided to put the dangerous thing until they figured out what to do with it. "And if I say yes, and he actually is as good as you're telling me he is, and he puts me in the hospital instead, then Counselor Volithan gets exactly what he wants," Dreamek said, because he respected Cale too much at this point to lie to him. "He gets to say the first incident was luck, and this one proves it. And if I win?" Dreamek considered the question longer than he meant to. "Then I genuinely don't know what happens next, but I don't think it stays quiet." Cale thought about his grandmother's voice on the delayed relay, about the choosing that lived in 5,000 mornings on a training mat rather than in any single moment of crisis, and he told Dreamek yes. Commander Ayabo Adeyemi arrived at Threshold Academy on the morning of the demonstration, 6 hours ahead of the scheduled session, and made a point of not announcing why she was there. She had read Senevak's report twice on the transit out, and she had spent enough years in Fleet's Human Integration Division to recognize, immediately, what Counselor Volithan's petition actually was underneath its careful scientific language. She had seen this pattern before on other worlds, in other integration disputes. A species discovers that humans are more physically capable than expected, panics quietly, and arranges a controlled demonstration specifically designed to produce a result that restores the old hierarchy. It rarely failed to embarrass someone. It was simply a question of who. She requested and was granted observer status for the demonstration, listed on the official roster only as I Adeyemi, Confederacy Liaison, which was true in the narrowest possible sense and told nobody in the room what she actually did for a living. The training annex had been set up with careful, performative caution. Padded flooring, a ring of safety barriers, medical staff positioned at 2 points along the perimeter, a small gallery of observers that included 3 board members, Dreamek Ithel Senevak, Counselor Brigath Volithan, sitting with the particular stillness of a man trying very hard not to look satisfied in advance, and near the back, a woman in a plain gray fleet-adjacent uniform that most of the room did not recognize, and did not think to ask about. Cale stood on one side of the ring in training gear a size too large for him, borrowed from the Academy's equipment store because nothing human-sized had ever needed to be kept in stock before. Instructor Catares stood on the other side, calm, economical in his movements, a man who had spent 3 decades making bigger, stronger, faster opponents than himself lose in controlled, professional, utterly humiliating fashion, and who saw absolutely nothing in the small human boy across from him that changed his expectations for how this would go. The referee, a neutral yet instructor borrowed from the Academy's athletics department, read the safety rules aloud, confirmed both participants understood them, and stepped back. "Begin," she said. For the first 3 seconds, nothing happened, because Cale did not move first, and Catares, professional, patient, 30 years unbeaten, did not need to rush. He closed the distance slowly, testing, the way he had tested 1,000 opponents before, watching for the telltale signs of an untrained fighter. Weight too far forward, hands too high, eyes locked on his hands instead of his center mass. He found none of those things. He found a boy standing in a low, settled stance, with his weight distributed exactly the way Senevak's report had described, watching his hips rather than his hands, breathing slow. That, more than anything, was the first moment Catares felt something other than confidence. The difference between the cafeteria and the training annex was that in the cafeteria, Cale's body had made every decision for him. In the annex, for the first time in his life, he made them himself, deliberately, with his grandmother's voice threaded through every motion like a rhythm he'd practiced 10,000 times. The choosing already happened, years before. Cadet struck first, a testing jab meant to gauge reaction speed rather than do damage, and Kale let it land on his raised forearm instead of trying to avoid it entirely, absorbing the impact the way Nana, Ajay, had drilled into him since he was 7, not flinching from contact, redirecting it. The instructor's arm bounced off the block at an angle that told him, instantly, that this was not an untrained boy protecting himself out of panic. This was a stance, a system, applied with intention. Cadet adjusted. He came in with a real combination this time. 3 strikes meant to close distance and end the match quickly, the kind of sequence that had ended 300 sparring matches in his career before his opponents had finished registering the first blow. Kale did not stand and trade with him, because Nana Ajay's system had never been built around standing and trading with someone larger. He moved with the strikes instead of against them, redirecting the second one into empty air, slipping inside the reach of the third. And for 1/2 second the entire gallery watched a 16-year-old boy standing chest to chest with a 30-year combat veteran. Inside the reach, where all of Cadet's size stopped being an advantage. That was where the fight actually ended, though it took another 8 seconds for everyone in the room to understand that. Kale's hand found the instructor's wrist, not a wild, reflexive grab like the one that had shattered Theth's arm, but a controlled hold, applied with exactly enough pressure to lock the joint without breaking it, a technique meant for restraint rather than damage, because Kale had decided, somewhere in the last 4 days of practicing this exact scenario in his head, that if he had to do this in front of an audience, he was going to do it in a way nobody could call an accident, and nobody could call reckless, and nobody could use as evidence that humans were dangerous animals who couldn't control themselves. He locked the hold, dropped his weight, and put instructor Cadet on the mat, controlled and immobilized, without breaking a single bone. The room was silent for 3 full seconds before the referee called it. "Match," she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the single syllable. Human student, Osei, wins by submission. Cadet, to his enormous credit, did not argue, did not make excuses, and did not look angry. He looked, when Kale released the hold and helped him up, like a man who had just had 30 years of professional assumptions rearranged in 11 seconds, and who understood exactly what he had just watched. "You held back," he said quietly, only to Kale, as the gallery erupted into noise behind them. "You could have broken it." "I know," Kale said. "Why didn't you?" "Because last time I didn't get to choose," Kale said. "This time I did." Counselor Brigath Valathan left the training annex before the gallery finished discussing what they had seen, and he did not file any further petitions with the board. Commander Ayabo Adeyemi introduced herself to Kale 2 hours later, in the same small annex room that had briefly been his exile and would, within the month, become something closer to an office. She did not offer him a position immediately. That would come later, through channels far more formal than a conversation in a repurposed lunchroom. But she told him, plainly, what she had come to Threshold Academy to find out, and what she now believed. Every species we've integrated into the Confederacy eventually teaches us something about how we've been measuring them wrong, she said. Usually it takes decades to figure out what that thing is. You just saved us most of those decades in about 15 seconds, twice. I didn't do it on purpose the first time. I know, she said. That's actually the part that matters most. What you did today, you did on purpose. That's the part that tells me what happens next, when someone gives you a reason to, and you have time to think about it instead of reacting. Most species we've met, given that kind of power and that kind of provocation, get worse the more time they have to decide. You got more careful. You got more precise. You held back on purpose, in front of people who were hoping you wouldn't. She let that sit for a moment before she continued. There are going to be a great many reports written about you over the next few years, Kale say. Committees, reviews, probably a treaty clause or two if I'm honest, because half the Confederacy is about to start asking uncomfortable questions about human physical capability that nobody's bothered asking before now. I'd like you to think about something before any of that happens. What's that? Whether you'd rather spend the next 10 years being the subject of those reports, Adeyemi said, or the person writing them. Kale did not answer her that day. He went back to his dormitory, sat on his bunk, and opened the delayed relay to call his grandmother, because there were some decisions that still needed her voice threaded through them before he could make them his own. She listened to the whole story without interrupting, the way she always had. And when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment on the other end of 11 light years of delay. You know, she said finally, when I was teaching you on those mats at 5 years old, I never once imagined a room full of aliens deciding what to think about our entire species based on how my grandson decided to hold a man's wrist. I taught you so you would come home safe. I did not teach you to change how the stars think about us. I know, Nana. But I am not surprised it happened this way, she said, and for the first time in the conversation, he heard something in her voice that might have been pride, or might have been something older and steadier than pride, the particular satisfaction of watching something planted a long time ago finally bear the fruit it was always going to bear. That is what happens when you raise someone properly, and then the world decides to test them anyway. The world finds out what was always true. It is only ever a surprise to the people who were not paying attention. Cale thought about the cafeteria and the training annex and Commander Adeyemi's question waiting somewhere ahead of him, and understood, with a calm that felt entirely new, that he was not afraid of whatever came next. He had already done the choosing. He had simply needed the world to catch up. Threshold Academy changed in small ways after that, the kind of changes that never made it into any official record, but that everyone who walked the halls could feel. Hall 3 got new cutlery within the month, a full set sized for human hands, quietly ordered and quietly installed, with no announcement and no apology attached to it, which Cale understood was its own kind of statement. DreamEck Ithel revised the discipline office's escalation protocols to include a mandatory review of asymmetric provocation, a phrase that existed everyone in the building knew, specifically because of one cafeteria and one tray of stew. Senevoc's paper on reflexive threshold response in juvenile human combat physiology became required reading in 3 different Confederacy training programs within the year, cited so often in later research that colleagues eventually just called it the OSE paper, without needing to explain further. CAT arrest requested, and was granted, a standing invitation to return to Threshold twice a semester, not to test students, but to teach a voluntary close-quarters awareness course open to any species who wanted to attend. His first class had 4 students. By the time Cale graduated 2 years later, it had 40, and half of them were Dravith. Thesk's arm healed within 6 weeks, though the reinforced strut never quite sat the way it had before. He did not return to Hall 3 that semester, and when he did come back, he did not sit near the 3rd table, and he did not throw anything at anyone again. He and Cale never became friends. That would have asked more of the story than either of them owed it. But 18 months later, in a hallway between classes, Thesk stopped him, said something short and formal in Dravith that Cale's translator rendered simply as, "I misjudged what you were," and walked on before Cale could decide how to answer. Cale never told anyone that conversation happened. Some corrections don't need witnesses to matter. Counselor Brigath Valithan lost his seat on the Trade Council 2 elections later, for reasons that had nothing officially to do with a training annex demonstration and everything unofficially to do with it. Nobody at Threshold mentioned the connection out loud, but everyone understood it anyway. And Cale Osei, 3 years after a tray of reconstituted stew went across his jacket in front of a cafeteria, full of people who had decided he did not matter enough to think twice about, stood in a fleet integration office on a station he had never expected to see, reading over a report with his own name at the top of it and Commander Adeyemi's signature at the bottom, and understood that his grandmother had been right about almost everything, except for one small detail. She had said the world would find out what was always true, and that it would only ever surprise the people who weren't paying attention. What she hadn't said, what neither of them had known to say, back on a training mat outside Kamasi, 5 years old and getting up before dawn, was that eventually he would be the one deciding who got to pay attention and what they were allowed to learn. Outside the office window, the station's viewport looked out over a slow wheel of stars that did not care, one way or another, what any single species decided to believe about another. That indifference had always struck Cale as the most honest thing in the galaxy. The stars kept turning whether anyone had learned their lesson or not, and the only real choice anyone got was what they did with the turning while it lasted. He thought about a boy sitting alone at the end of a cafeteria table, eating with a fork his grandmother had mailed him because no one had thought to ask if a cutlery fit his hands. He thought about how small that boy had let himself become, on purpose, for 2 years, because it was easier than being seen. It struck him now as strange that it had taken a tray of spilled stew to undo that smallness rather than any conversation, any friendship, any ordinary kindness offered across a lunch table. Sometimes the world only listens once it has been startled into it. He did not think that was fair. He no longer expected it to be. He signed the report and got back to work.